Hey, welcome back to class. Hopefully everybody had a great Thanksgiving week. How long was your Thanksgiving? Forever. Like mine was church and then one family and then another family, and it just kind of stretched on forever. All right, great. Tonight we're going to be talking about serving as senders. And this would be the role that the people that remain in America play. Next week, we're going to be hearing from my senior pastor, and he's going to be talking about how to send as a pastor from the home church. But tonight, my wife is going to be sharing with us about what it's like to have a sending team and the role of that sending team and the significance of that sending team. So serving as senders is our topic for this evening. Now, we use an analogy called holding the rope. When William Carey went out from England many years ago and he went to India, he talked about a group of men that stood with him the entire time. And he said, I would be willing to go and literally be lowered into that place. India at that time had no gospel whatsoever. There was probably 200 or 300 million people. And so it was way more in reach then than it is now. And it was a lot more demonic. And he said, but I don't want to go down into the pit unless I know that there's somebody on the other end holding the rope. And so when we think about serving as senders, we imagine in our mind the mathematical equation of 1 to 10. 10 people holding the rope, 1 person going down into the pit. And unless those people remain back here and hold that rope, that person on the other end feels like they're completely alone. Now, why do we use the analogy of 10 people versus 1 or 2 people? Because the amount of care that's needed for a missionary is quite diverse. And every person has a different calling, they have different giftings, and they have different skills that they can offer to the missionary that's going. And so you don't want a sending team of 1 or 2. You want a sending team of 5 minimum. 10 is more ideal. And so when those people are willing to hold the rope, then you can go down into that pit and know, I am not alone. Now, of course, Jesus will never leave you nor forsake you. He told you, I will always be with you as I'm sending you out. But when you know that you've got a group of believers that are there with you, that are holding that rope, that are a part of your sending, it changes everything for you in the mission field. The sense of loneliness and the sense of being disconnected is never gone, but it's diminished down to a more manageable amount. It's very rare that people have the tenacity of Paul the Apostle or the ability of some of these early pioneer missionaries. Most people that go out, especially from our generation, that's used to fellowship and community and not working as hard as they did in the past. Today we have so much luxury in all of our life that we're not used to having to truly sink our teeth or hold on to these callings to the point where we feel like we're going to die. That's a kind of a bygone character trait of the Christian. And so when somebody's holding the rope, no matter how dedicated you are, you say, thank you, Lord, for giving me those people. Paul the Apostle mentioned in almost every one of his books in the New Testament, and thank you for praying. Thank you for being there. When so-and-so came to visit me, it brought joy to my heart that I can't express. But on the other end, Paul's talking about Jesus meeting him in his cell and speaking to him in dreams. But it's the other believers that are a part of his life that were that extra boost that Paul the Apostle needed. So tonight, holding the rope, what is it going to take to truly love and care for people? So as we go through developing a care team, we're going to talk about many of the different trials that a missionary goes through so that the people that are surrounding that missionary in prayer, they're aware of what their missionary is going to encounter. They're aware of what their missionary is going to have to deal with. Because most people that are senders have never truly gone. They might have gone on a short-term trip, but we've already talked about short-term trips is just a taste of what it's like to live there. So we want to realize what is it going to take for us here to understand what they're going through so that when we hold that rope, we don't hold it lightly. And we don't just, flippantly say, yeah, I'm a part of their care team. We make this a priority of our life. So we're going to walk through those details. And the majority of the things that we're going to talk about tonight are going to come from Serving as Senders by Neil Perello. I brought 4 copies with me. I thought I had more. All I have is 4. I'll sell those to you for $5 each. I bought them in bulk from Neil, so I got them for a better price. So let's go ahead and welcome up our guest speaker, Heidi Douglas, my wife, so that she can share with us about how to serve as senders. applaud?
Hi there. I'm glad that I can be there with you, here with you tonight. So when I pushed it, it's going now. We're on red. Can you hear me good? Okay, awesome. So like Rob said, this book was so foundational for our team when God called us to move overseas. And the best thing that we did for our care team is we put one in the hand of everybody who was praying for us. So anybody that was said, either supporters or people, financial supporters or people who said, we want to stand behind you and back you, we gave them this book, and it was very, very helpful. And I think that's why we were so successful when God first called us on our adventure to Africa. So I'm going to share just a little bit about being in this class. I'm sure Rob shared with you our testimony, but for the video's sake as well. My husband and I have been involved in missions for the past 22 years. Are we good?
I forgot my remote control.
You need that. We spent 4 years in Uganda, Africa, and we lived in a refugee settlement there working with Sudanese refugees in the country of Uganda. And when we were there, we really focused on biblical training. So we had Bible studies and Bible colleges. We also had a feeding center for malnourished babies, and some of our ladies on our team taught English. So we kind of did a lot of different things, but really biblical training to nationals so that they could then do the work in church plant has always been our focus. We moved back to the States for 5 years, and it was during that time after Africa that God helped us to establish Saving Grace World Missions, which is a sending organization through our home church, which is Calvary Chapel Saving Grace, and that church is in Yorba Linda. Then God called Rob and I to move to Sri Lanka, and we were there with our 3 little babies for the next 2 years. And there we focused on pastoral and missionary training among the Sri Lankan people. So we worked alongside a Gospel for Asia and helped in their Bible college train their missionaries to go out. So since that time, God's now called us back home, but we still work overseas. So we're still very involved, not so much anymore with Sri Lanka, but still with Sudan, and raising up our national missionaries there now to do the work of the ministry. And then Rob travels back and forth. So we have a ministry that's called Ends of the Earth Ministries, and so that's kind of our focus, is continuing on training up and raising up nationals so that they can church plant and do evangelism. So as a missionary on the field for these past several years, I've been the recipient of an amazing care team. And because I've experienced a couple different missions experiences, I've also not been the recipient of a care team pretty much at all. So I kind of know what it's like to do both sides of that. And I really think that my experience in Africa was so completely different than Sri Lanka in so many ways that I'm going to share with tonight. And I think that I don't think I would have gone through so many of the struggles that I went through in Sri Lanka personally had I had the support of a care team like we did when God called us out to Africa. So we're going to talk about some of those differences and how that helped me on the field. So tonight I want to give you some insight on the struggles that long-term missionaries face, and to show you some practical ways that you then can be used to care for your missionaries in 3 different ways: while they're preparing to go, while they're actually on the field, and then as God brings them back home and they return back to their home culture. That also is a season that a lot of times is overlooked, and there's that transition that they need some help being transitioned back into home life here. So I wanted to give you a spear analogy. This analogy was given by Wes Bentley when God called our team of 5 people to move from our church in Yorba Linda. We were really young. And I remember him standing up with his big, deep voice. And Wes works in the Sudan, and he works with Far Reaching Ministries. And he held up a spear at our church, and he said, the missionary is just this tip here of the spear. But everything else behind the missionary is what is needed to help that missionary be successful and be productive, as they are really the tip that is going into those dark areas where Satan has permeated and kept people in bondage for thousands of years. But they're not going to be very effective just as a tip. They need the support of the thrust of the body of Christ behind them to really be effective. And it was such a good example, and we so experienced the reality of what that looks like. Just this tip is not going to be very effective. But once you put the force of everybody behind you, as you're reaching into those really dark, spiritually dark places, so much spiritual warfare that happens when you're pioneering a work into very dark places, if without the rest of the body behind us, we would not have been as effective as we were. So I really like that visual aid. The missionary is not the Lone Ranger. I think that sometimes we can kind of take on, we're used to, as Americans, independent. We are so independent. We raise our own money, we save our, we buy everything, we do everything, we live in our little bubbles, and we're just used to being independent. And as you become a missionary, sometimes as God starts to call the missionary, they can feel like, I can do this myself. Why do I have to raise a team? If God's calling me, He's going to provide, He's going to do it all. And so they kind of can have a Lone Ranger mentality, or like that Iron Man mentality, but God doesn't call us individually to go and conquer the world. He calls the body of Christ to be involved in this thing called missions. So it doesn't just take one person, it takes the church to do missions. Because it's an army that He's calling to fight this battle. So every one of us has an important part to play in seeing the Great Commission accomplished. And in Romans 10:15, it shows us two very important ministries that are needed in order for the lost to be reached. So I'm going to turn there, and that's Romans 10:15. A very familiar verse. It says, "How are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." So we see that there are two ministries here. There is one that is preaching and one that is sending. It goes on to say, "But have they not all obeyed the gospel?" Wait. I'm going to start in verse 13. I'm going to go back just a little bit. It says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then shall they call on Him whom they have not believed? And how they shall believe in Him in whom they have never heard? And how shall they hear without someone preaching? And how shall they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." So there are those who preach and those that send the preachers. And not one is not more important than the other. You really have to have both working together to accomplish the Great Commission. You may never set your feet on foreign soil. You might not ever learn a foreign language and preach the gospel in somebody else's native tongue, but through intercession, encouragement, moral support, logistics support, financial support, prayer, you are working alongside of your missionary to get that job done. And in 1 Corinthians 3, I'm going to turn to 1 Corinthians 3. Verses 6 through 10. It says, "I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive the wages according to his labor." So I love those scriptures because it's talking about planting and watering, and one is not more important than the other. We need all of that. We need the whole body of Christ to be working in their giftings to see the Great Commission accomplished. So now that you've seen this biblical precedence for both missionaries and the senders of missionaries, I want to give you some insight on what your missionary is going through during the different phases that they are either preparing to be on the field, or coming home from the field. So there's a slide on your sheet and one up here, and this kind of represents the missionary life timeline. This diagram shows you the physical, the emotional, and the mental and spiritual life timeline of a missionary during their missions experience. So this dotted line right here in the middle, that just kind of represents normal living, although none of our lives are completely flat. We all have ups and downs no matter where we are in the world. But that just kind of represents life maybe before the call, life before missions. And then the up and down line that sometimes is above and sometimes is below, that really represents that roller coaster ride that your missionary goes through emotionally as he lives out their missions experience. Missions is a wonderful thing that strips you of everything in your life that you once knew as normal. So everything that we know how to live here. We know how to grocery shop here. We know how to drive here. We know how to work here. We know how to speak We know how to do everything because this is our home culture. But you step into a foreign environment and all of a sudden you are stripped of everything. Smells, tastes, sights, just the ability to do the simplest tasks. And it strips you of everything that is normal and forces you to live outside of your comfort zone. So anytime, maybe if you've been on a missions trip, you've experienced that in a small amount. You've been forced out of your comfort zone, forced to eat food that maybe you didn't like or that was super spicy that you weren't used to, or use a bathroom that's very different than the bathroom at home that you have. Whatever your experience, you realize this is so uncomfortable. It's wonderful, but it's also very uncomfortable, and it strips you of everything that's normal. So of course there's going to be highs and lows along the road. Now the vertical lines, the ones that go up and down, those represent time periods. And those times are gonna vary depending on every person because we're all different. And also depending on how far away from your home culture the missionary has gone. So if you're ministering in Tijuana, you are right over the border and you know that you can drive back home and get an In-N-Out cheeseburger, right? If you are in Russia or you are in Papua New Guinea, you can't do that, right? So it is, the further you go away from your home culture, everything is intensified drastically. So that first line over there to the far side of the screen talks about the call of God. This is the time where your missionary has just come out of his prayer closet and he's wrestled with his own feelings of inadequacy. He's been promised God's all-sufficiency. He's felt and heard the call of God on his life. I'm sending you. Will you go and minister for me? Will you go be that voice for me? And like Isaiah, they're like, here am I, send me. And they're excited and scared all at the same time. And you notice that the excitement, that those levels of emotion start to rise as the call of God is given. Sometimes they come out with boldness and they start announcing, God's called me, I know God's called me. Sometimes that call takes a month, a year, several years, and there's this wrestling inside of them. So there's an emotional roller coaster that's happening. And every ounce of his body has gone through feelings of excitement and apprehension all at the same time. So there's this rise of emotion. I remember when our pastor made that simple announcement, just during announcements. I mean, how anointed is your pastor's announcements, And all 5 of us were sitting in the sanctuary in different places. And our pastor said, hey, I was at a missions expo and I was talking to some missionary from Uganda and he was inviting church people, lay people to come out for a period of time and teach the Bible to pastors and to people in Uganda. And he said, most of you sitting in this congregation have a better biblical foundation just because we teach verse by verse, and most of you have been sitting in church for years, than these pastors that are even over there preaching and leading churches. And so he just said, there's a need. Pray about it. Maybe God's calling you. God used that simple announcement to all 5 of us heard it. All 5 of our hearts just went. And I don't even remember what the rest of the service was about. And then after the service, we just kind of found each other and, did you hear that? Did you hear that? Let's start praying. And we didn't tell anybody. And we started praying. Well, pretty soon the call of God calling us, he started defining it and shaping it. And we realized, okay, it's to Sudanese. Well, where's Sudan? Let's find it on the map. We don't even know. Okay, it's Africa, it's Sudan, it's Sudanese people, and then God kept confirming it with scriptures. And we hadn't even told anybody, parents, pastors, elders, nobody. We just prayed, us 5 people, but it became so strong and so clear that God was calling us. There was just this rush of excitement that Rob and I, a couple of months into it now, after not saying anything, approached my mom and dad one night, hey, can we come over? We need to talk to you. And I think they thought we were going to say we're pregnant or something exciting. And we said, God is calling us to the mission field and we're moving to Africa. And it was like, my parents love the Lord. And it ended up being one of the greatest things they ever heard. But it didn't feel like that when we announced the call of God to them. It was just like, whoa, that is not what we expected. And they had to wrestle with my call, that my parents were called just like I was called, even though they weren't going, they were called to be senders. And were they going to trust God to be big enough to take care of their little girl in a really scary country? So the call of God, as the missionary senses that call of God, as they announce the call of God, that those emotions start to rise. And now the next phase is when the call is confirmed. So the church or the mission board begins to confirm, yes, we believe God is calling you. We are going to get behind you. Now becomes that season where it's sometimes months or even years where they start to raise support, gather a support team behind them. They're sending out prayer letters. They're getting finances together. And your missionaries' emotions, you can see that they're starting to go up and down. And it really depends on who they are talking to at this point, because they're excited, but of course they're also apprehensive. And they have a lot of their own personal fears, but they know God's calling them, but they hear some very discouraging things sometimes during this call. So especially in the second half of the class, we're going to talk about how you can come alongside of them during this season to really be a support to them. Because when, maybe they don't have Christian parents, and they're getting a lot of the negative, and how's it all going to work, and where's the nuts and bolts? Well, we know when God calls us on the mission field, he doesn't give us A to Z. He just says go, and we say, okay, we're going to take that first step, and then we take the next one. But that's not really comforting to parents if you have a young child who wants to go on the mission field. So there's a lot of apprehension during this season of the call confirmed. The next stage is called the departure and the honeymoon stage. And you can see from the departure all the way up to the honeymoon, you're just climbing, right? So this is the season where he steps off the plane into his new environment. He actually is there. He's on the plane. He gets off the plane. He's now in his new country or her new country. And the honeymoon has begun, right? Everything is new. God's going to use me. I've listened to the call. I'm stepping out in faith. This is an adventure of faith. I'm so excited. And their feelings are very, very high at this season. So this period is normally, it lasts for about 1 to 2 months. Okay? So honeymoon lasts for about 1 to 2 months. The missionary moves around in this protective bubble during this time, enjoying all the quaint newness. Right? Everything's new. Even the bugs are new, right? Everything, the showers that consist of a cold bucket of water and a cup. Oh, this is kind of cool. I am a missionary. And they're doing it. There's so much to observe. There's so much to take in. It's just all so different. And yet at this phase, because there is so much excitement and newness to it, those emotions are climbing high. But you can notice they get to a place normally about 1 to 2 months, and then enters the phase of disillusionment. This is the time after the honeymoon phase when the cultural stress sets in and causes your missionary to feel disillusionment, and sometimes that stage varies, okay? So sometimes it can normally last between 2 to 6 months where you start to feel like, this isn't super fun. Like, what did I sign up for? This is hard, it starts to get hard. And this stage is kind of that stage where your missionary wakes up one morning and goes, oh, I just want a hot shower, right? That bucket and that cold water is like, oh. And so they start complaining a little bit. Everything is not so new. Now it's kind of uncomfortable. He realizes he's committed himself to circumstances that are no longer quaint. They're just uncomfortable. And that adventure of discovery has turned into, what's next? They're kind of dreading what's next. This is tough. This is tougher than I thought. Maybe dysentery has kept him up all night, or maybe they've battled their first case with malaria. They become depressed over their lack of progress with learning the language, because you're sitting there 2 to 6 months, and at first it's exciting, and you're just trying to, sign language to people, but when you can't communicate, you start to feel really like you're lacking, and you just want to have a real conversation, but you can't, because you're in this culture that you can't connect. The first hints of persecution maybe have arisen. 6 months into it, people are like, okay, this person's not going away, and we're not sure that we want him here. And so people that might have welcomed your missionary openly at the beginning, now they're like, wait, you're bringing in this new God. Who are you talking about? Wait, you're changing. Is this going to change our culture? And you get a little bit of resistance. Maybe the realization that people are not going to change as fast as that missionary had expected. We go over with great, God's going to just use me and everything's going to go boom, 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 boom. And you get over there and it's like a screeching halt. And they're like, I want to be effective and I feel like I'm just doing nothing. Sometimes they can feel like, God, why are you doing this to me? Like, this isn't as fun. This kind of lost its newness. It's lost its fun. All of these feelings bring loneliness and isolation. So disillusionment, loneliness, and isolation. They feel very alone, very isolated. They can't communicate to the nationals, And you'll notice that most missionaries do not share these struggles with those that are their support team. Why? Because they're like, I don't want to look like a failure, and I don't want to share my weaknesses because they're going to misunderstand. I'm here for the long haul, but I can't tell them that I'm frustrated with everything, or I don't like this or that, or this is really hard, or I'm really lonely, or I'm really homesick, because what's my church going to think? Are they going to stop my support? I can't share that with a supporter. So they're feeling very isolated during this season. This is when they need their support team's encouragement. 90% of missionaries who return from the field before they had planned to returned during this time of disillusionment. Okay? So watch that. We need to be aware of that this is natural. And for us to come alongside of them and say, hey, I'm reading this great book, Serving as Senders, and it says this is natural. Like, how are you doing at this stage? Because it must be hard right now. Is this hard for you? Is this hard for you? You know, reading this book and asking them some of the questions, they can feel like, oh, yeah, you get me. You're not here, but you understand what I'm going through, and you're a safe place to talk to. So this is when, like, teaching tapes from home, especially if they don't have a church that they're a part of, you know, CDs or worship music or a good Christian book or, you know, just anything that you can think of that would show them we're behind you, we remember you, we're praying for you, we know that it's hard. This happened to us in Africa. We hit the ground. I mean, God had everything was moving so fast to get us to Africa that we thought when we hit the ground, we were just going to keep running with that same momentum. And all of a sudden, God just put the brakes on everything, and we had to get the UN's approval to live in the refugee settlement where we wanted to live with the refugees. And the UN wouldn't give it to us. And so it took over a year for us to get approved to actually live in the settlement before we could even build a house. So we would go back and forth, and we were living in a city. Well, I didn't feel called in any way to the city. I felt called to the Sudanese and live in the bush. And so that was really difficult. It's like, God, what are you doing during this season where you called us here? We know you called us here, but this was really hard. And we also thought we were going to, you know, God said, go to Africa and minister to kids. And we started to put all the flesh on the bones and say, okay, it's going to look like this. And we're going to have an orphanage, and we're going to, maybe I'll adopt kids because I was barren at the time. We couldn't have our own. So I'm going to have an orphanage. I'm going to be a mom of all these kids. And all of a sudden we realized everything we thought it was going to look like this first year, God just slowed us down and said, nope, that's nothing like it's going to look like. And so there was this disillusionment. Wait, what's happening? And so you can see that there was at that disillusionment, there's this great crash, and you actually go below the normal level into a little bit of depression. And that's really normal. The next phase after disillusionment is, hold on a second, let me find one, is coping, right? That's where we're at. So this is the phase when your missionary is really just holding on for dear life. And you can see coping, they're under the normal line. Maybe the disillusionment up, down, has kind of stopped a little bit. Now it's just kind of like, but it's below normal, right? So emotionally, this is a tough time. This is a phase when your missionary is holding on. They've embraced the reality that this is what it's truly like to live here. Okay, I understand. I have the routine of living here, and this is difficult. Homesickness is a daily reality. This phase normally comes between 6 months to 1.5 years. So that's the coping phase. They're feeling very separated from those back home because now they've been gone long enough that they don't get the emails. They don't get the likes on Facebook. They don't get the letters. They don't get the care packages from homes. They really feel forgotten during this time of coping. So there's a lot of homesickness. They're feeling separated, isolated. They have a sense of being forgotten, and emotional support is very important. For me, when we moved to Sri Lanka, my honeymoon lasted about 1 week. And then the heat and the humidity and the loneliness, we didn't go with a team, whereas in Africa, we went with a team, a group of us. So it was like we had our mini church right there. We could encourage each other. Well, now we're in Sri Lanka where it's just my husband, and he's going off doing the ministry, but I'm home with 3 little kids in a very hot, humid, dusty house in a city with like cut glass around all the walls. So I felt like I'm in this fortress, and I don't know how to go out. I don't know how to get anywhere. How am I going to bring my 3 kids in tow? And it was like all of a sudden, even within a week, I was just down, and I was into this, coping stage really quickly. And I remember crying on the floor in the bathroom, feeling like, I remember telling God, I feel like I'm a fish out of water. like I was in this fishbowl that was filled with fellowship and Christians and community and women's ministry, like ministry for myself, where I was just swimming in it. And I feel like, God, you just scooped me out, and I'm sitting there on the sink just going, like trying to breathe in this place. I am so spiritually dry and lonely, and this is tough. This is really hard, Lord. And during that time, I was really just hanging on. I mean, obviously, God, you called me, but even my times in the Word were very dry. So that's really difficult, because you're in this coping stage and you're not having these wonderful, Spirit-filled times with the Lord. You just feel like, are you even there? Are you listening? And I remember pastors and teams coming to stay in our house to go do like VBS outreach and, village outreach. And they would come, and, I'm providing for them, and I'm cooking their meals, and they go out, they do ministry during the day, they come home, they share all the great things God did. And I remember feeling more lonely when they left, because not one time did any of those pastors or any of those teams look at me in the face and say, how are you doing? How can I pray for you? What's it like living here? Like just connecting, like ministering to the missionary. And that's one thing that I always tell people when you're a short-term person, remember that those missionaries, they don't have the fellowship like you just came from. They have such little fellowship. So you're the fellowship. And when you come and you spend all of it on the nationals, which you should, but when you're back in their home, bring a worship CD. Seek God with that missionary. Ask them spiritually how they're doing, how you can pray for them on the spot, lay hands on them, like be the life to them, because they could be in a coping stage, and you could be the very thing that God at that moment uses to get them out of coping into adjustment. So the next phase is adjustment. And this occurs 1 to 2 years into being on the field. You begin to laugh again. And this is when you know that you're not just coping. You now understand the new culture that you're living in, and now you can joke about it, but you're not joking sarcastically and critically. That's what you were doing in the coping. You were pretty critical, and you were pretty down on the culture. Now you can laugh about, like, well, this is Africa. Well, of course we're delayed. Well, of course the police are asking for a bribe. Well, you just laugh about it because this is just the way it is, and now you've accepted it. Instead of being shocked or annoyed at the new culture, you begin to adjust to it and joke about it. And it just becomes more normal to you. You feel more like you're in your own skin now. You feel more comfortable with the day-to-day flow of living in your new environment. And you still, at this point, have fonder feelings a lot of times towards America, because you've lived there longer, you understand that better, but you find yourself comparing less. When you're in the coping stage, you're everything, this is not like how we do it. Oh, why do they have to do it that way? Everything is comparing it, and America is almost put on the pedestal. Now you start to see opposite of that. You start to see the good things in the new culture and maybe some of the negative things in your home culture, and you start to admire some of those things in the new culture that God has you. We would go to this little town that was down our bumpy dirt road, like you lose the Land Cruiser in the dirt roads to try to get out onto the main tarmac road, the pavement. And then we would travel about 15 minutes down the way to go to dinner. And so as a team, this was like our big Friday night outing. We're going to go get out of the refugee settlement and drive down our bumpy dirt road 15 minutes and go to dinner. And it would be hilarious because like chickens would be running around and a goat would be tied up when you go use the bathroom, and you're seeing the ladies cook in the kitchen, and you're like, there's my dinner. And you're like, the little kids are going to catch it and kill it and pluck it. And you're waiting and you're drinking your Coke, and like everything's broken down and all the paint's chipped off and there's mold on the walls, and you're just like, yay, like this is, and you're happy with it. Like you're content to be there. You're not wishing you were at Cheesecake Factory. You're like, hey, this is cool. We got out of our little environment, and this is like we're going out, big night on the town. And you just can laugh and you can enjoy it being so different. I remember during this time, one of the guys on my team, he and I were writing the proposal to the UN, trying to get them to approve that we live in the refugee settlement. And oh my gosh, we just would be in tears laughing because Africans love big language, and they wanted us to not say orphans, they wanted us to say unaccompanied minors. And it was so ridiculous how many times, because we had to keep talking about orphans, so every line had the word unaccompanied minors, and both of us are like English, we went to college and we took English classes, and we're like, this sounds so ridiculous, but it's so African, and we would just call it WOG. I don't know what that stands for, but we would just laugh. We would be in tears giggling at how ridiculous it was, and that's where I realized we've adjusted. Like, I'm no longer angry at the system. We've accepted the system for what it is, and we can just laugh about it. So now that's the adjustment, and you'll notice in adjustment those emotions start to rise again, and then the next section is settling, and this happens about 2 years after being there, which is really important if you feel like God is calling you to long-term missions, that you don't say, well, I'm going to go for a year, or I'm going to go for 2 years, because really, technically, it takes about 2 years, if you're pretty far from your home culture, it takes about 2 years for you to understand the language, the culture, the people, the way life flows, and to finally get into this settling phase. And then you feel like, okay, I'm settled, now you're going to go back to America. This is when you really start to be able to be effective, and the work of the ministry can actually take place. So, long-term missions is longer than 2 years. So just to keep that in mind. So your missionary has completely embraced the place, the people, the food, the culture, and they can actually say, I like it here. This feels like home. I remember the day that happened for me. It was about 2 to 2.5, maybe even 3 years into the call, and we were living in the refugee settlement. We did have our own little grass house at the time. The UN had finally given us, and we'd all built our own little area. And I was driving the Land Cruiser with my baby and driving to a women's Bible study, and all these little black, naked, tiny little African kids would run out, and I remember thinking the sky was so blue and the clouds were so white and the green palm trees with the bananas hanging off of them. It just was so picturesque. And all the kids would run out to whenever a car, because we were like, there was 2 cars in the refugee settlement with thousands of people. And so anytime there was a car, that was like the big thing. So they would come and go, bye, bye. And they were just so precious. And I remember driving to go do ministry and thinking, God, I'm home. Love it here, I'm home. It was that very night that my husband and I are laying in bed, and Rob says, I feel like God is stirring my heart, and then he might be calling us back to go back and live in America. And I went, what? Like, he might be calling you, but he's not calling me. I'm like, what? And I really remember that season of like, I feel like I'm fine, like this is finally home, and now you want me to, and I didn't feel at that point that America was home. And so thankfully it took us about, I think it must have been a 3-year mark, because it took us a whole nother year to raise up another family to take our place. So I got to live there for another year. So we were there a total of 4 before God called us back to the States to establish our church's missions organization. But I can remember just going that day that I just felt like this is home. And so when your missionary gets to that point, they have settled. Now, the next phase you can notice is re-entry. And you'll notice that immediately that re-entry has you're below the normal line, and there's a lot of conflicting emotions. So as surely as the missionary journey had a starting point, it has an ending point. And your missionaries have mixed feelings during this time, because yes, they want to come back home to America, but they've made new friends. And like I said, that feels normal to them now. That feels like home. They've maybe been speaking in another language and thinking in another culture for years of their life, 5, 10 years of their life. So coming back to America seems almost foreign to them. Even though they have family here and everything, things have changed here while they've been gone. He has new ideas and ideals. He's changed. He's changed his behavior, and he knows it's going to be difficult to integrate back into his old environment, back into the States. And you have changed too. Right? I remember coming back home and going, wait, how did that mall get there? That used to be like tree groves, and what happened to all the yucca trees lining this street? And, just even the surroundings were completely different. Even after being gone just for 4 years, things were different. Also, my friends were different. When we left, nobody had kids. I didn't have kids. I moved back 4 years later, everybody's got kids. Well, before we left, we'd stay up all night, we'd seek God in the sanctuary, we'd go to each other's houses, there was fellowship all hours of the night, seeking God till 2 a.m. Now everybody's got young families, so we come back home, that everything that I knew to be normal about America, everybody had changed. Life had continued to go on. Maybe your missionary's heart has been broken with compassion for the lost of where they are, and there are few to take his place, and there's still work to be done, but God is starting to call them back home. So there's this emotional and psychological and even spiritual pulse of your missionary that starts to drop because of some of those reasons. Some missionaries feel extremely isolated upon return. They don't feel American, but they also don't feel completely their other culture. So they're just kind of in this weird limbo place, and they're experiencing reverse culture stress. And most Christian people here in America, we just think, well, of course, you're back home. This is all normal to you. But there is a huge re-entry adjustment, and depression during this stage is most common. A lot of missionaries deal with depression in re-entry, and we'll share in the second half of the class some of the things that might be said to them or that we can do to help them cope with that. These feelings can last for about 1 to 3 months. Okay, so depending on the type of support they have, on who invites them over, on who really cares to stop and listen to what their life has been like all these years, and really if they feel like people care, and if they are struggling, they have some key people in their life that will help walk them down that road, then it can last shorter. But it does normally last for about 1 to 3 months, and strong support and a listening ear are vital. And then you go into the resettling stage. So now you can see as you start to feel you're out of the re-entry and back into the resettle, and life now is becoming normal again. So this is when the missionaries who has been trained to anticipate that stress of coming home, they have that strong re-entry support team, and they're fully integrated into that new, into their American culture once again. So in looking at all of this, my prayer is that many of you will be called to the ministry of being this kind of a support team, realizing what your missionary is going through, and at what stage then that you can come alongside of them and really be that support, speak encouragement. And in the second half, we'll talk about all the different ways that we can do that practically. But before we break, I want to talk about, has any of you, I don't know your missions experience. So if you've gone on the mission field, even if it was a few days somewhere, but it was a really different experience than what you're used to, have you gone through any of these? So I'll open it up for that. Yeah.
I think I've done short-term missions now with the new one coming up.
Yeah.
The first two were very, 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 it was a time of confusion, but excitement.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the confirmation part, especially letting the few people know where you're going.
Yeah.
And getting the pushback, the negativity.
Yeah.
Even from, family members
Yes.
who love the Lord.
Yes.
So I can totally relate to that. That
Yeah.
is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
And
That's good.
God, is this something you want me to do? And you're not getting the answer, and then when you think it does, you get someone who is like a firm believer telling you, I'm very concerned about this,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that you should do this, and you're like, whoa,
Yeah.
you're like a very.
Because sometimes we expect our unbelieving family to say that, or somebody that we know loves us, but hey, we can rationalize it by, they don't know the Lord like I know the Lord. But when you have a Christian saying that to you, it can throw you off a little bit. And so to be able to, talk to a missions pastor and talk to your pastor and hear, because we want wisdom, right? Because maybe we need wisdom. In the multitude of counselors, there is great wisdom. We don't want to just run off and do things impetuously if we feel like God's calling us somewhere. So we want that wisdom, but we also know that there's a spiritual element of warfare involved, and the enemy would love to discourage you before you ever get started. So that's happens a lot. Anybody else? Or maybe you know of somebody, a friend, that you've watched some of this happen with?
I have glimmers of all of it, a lot of it, just in a 17-day trip. I took 3 of them also to Uganda.
Okay.
And Rob said that you guys met up with the Dangers up in the boat.
Yeah.
That's where we were. So
Oh,
I
neat.
went with the team, so we're insulated. But the call was clear. The confirmation came with just the harmony that came with the
Great.
Of course, the honeymoon, just the newness of it all was rad. And then the delusionment wasn't too crazy. I think there was frustration in the knowing that time was short and you couldn't really invest a lot of yourself into too much, and you kind of had to also be flexible as to what the needs were there. And so as far as like the coping there was some of that adjustment, a little bit of that. It was all kind of fast track.
Sure.
And then the settling, gosh, it was troubling. In fact, I remember the first 1 or 2 times I went, I had to struggle with what part of it did I really sort of experience any sort of impact. And so thankfully Facebook was around. I was able to hook up with a lot of the kids online.
Neat.
Which was pretty neat. And then what's the other part of the settling?
Did you have any difficulty with reentry? Coming back home?
Crazy tough. It was weird because the time I wasn't working, and I was volunteering a lot of time here at church. I grew up here.
Yeah.
And but I had the freedom of coming and going with volunteer work on my own. I wasn't committed to it. Like I didn't have that must be there thing like job. And I remember in my free time around it, I was just struggling with that whole duplicity of neither knowing this was my home or was that really my home kind of thing, and all the comparison part. And that lasted longer than I thought after 2 short trips. It would last for like a couple months.
Yeah.
And then I remember.
And that's only a 17-day trip.
Yeah.
And that reentry hits us harder than we realize. And there's very limited training, even on short-term missions trips, to prepare you that that's normal to come back home.
And then the not having any real, I would meet with the people with the missions pastor here till 20, and we would connect a little bit, but it's like trying to explain what you went through is really hard because unless you were there, you really don't know how to convey it. It's like stuff. But then the resettlement part, it never really happened. It was like I still know I need to go, and this has been 6 years since I went last, so just this sort of wrestling with where my heart's at the last. Thankfully, Lord gave me a job here, so I've been for the last 5 years here, but I told Rob when I first signed up, I know it's got to be long term.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
I won't take too much time. Did you guys ever come back in between the 4 years to stuff?
Yes, actually we did, and some people have different views on that. We suggest coming back home if you can. It's expensive. It was Africa, so it's a big plane ticket. And then once I had a child, we had 1 child in Africa, that's another plane ticket. So so sometimes that's not feasible. Some of our missionaries, they didn't come home as much as Rob and I did, but we were kind of like the leader of the team, and so we would come home, like share with the churches what was happening, help to raise support, even get short-term teams excited to come over there. And my parents helped us financially to be able to do that, so we weren't taking from ministry money. We had family that, especially when I did finally conceive, because we were told we were never going to be able to have kids. So when I did conceive my Hannah, I knew I didn't want to birth her in Africa. So I think I flew home at 7.5 or 8 months, and I came home about a month before Rob did. He was building the house at that time. So I came home because of flying pregnant, and then he met me right before delivery, and then we took her back at 6 weeks. So so we did come back and forth. And I thought there's, in my heart, the call was so strong, I never felt like, oh, I want to stay in America. It was always like, I got to get back home. I mean, God called us so clearly there that I would have been a sin to stay home. And so even when we got pregnant, even when we told we were never going to be able to, and some people were like, well, are you going to stay here now? I'm like, why? Like, God's called us. The call was so strong that of course I'm going to go move back there. The child, that was the blessing of the Lord, so we're just going to take her with us, But that wasn't a hindrance to want to keep me here. So, but some people do struggle, like sometimes, because if you come back during coping and you're really having a difficult time in your culture over there, and then you come back here and you're in that comparing stage anyway, and you're kind of like bagging on that culture and everything's good about America, and you come home during then, it's going to be really easy to get planted here. a ministry opportunity. Oh, you could be used in this way. And I just think I'll just stay here. And that's where a lot of people do. Like when I say 90% do come home during that phase. And a lot of things too, if you've been on short term, during the disillusionment, especially this, a lot of this has to do with team conflict. And you'll be surprised that the number one reason why people come home from the mission field isn't because of the nationals or it being really hard culturally, it's team conflict. So if God calls you to go with a team, there's this interpersonal, you're used to being your own island, making your own decisions. Now you're living communally as a team and working as a team in a very difficult environment, and you're rubbing people the wrong way, and it's really hard. So that's another thing to just be aware of that your missionary is also going through. So
Does it help a lot that you guys had a history together as a team before you left?
yeah, because we did, most of us all went to the same church. One girl was a missionary, had flown in from Albania to come be with our team, so we didn't know her. We kind of met her on the fly, like right when we hit the ground. She just kind of, we all became a family then. But the rest of us did know each other pretty well. And, the Lord was gracious with that team because we had, one of our men had schizophrenia. One of our men was extremely moody. We never knew which way, we didn't know which, I won't say his name, we don't know which person we were going to get. Are we going to get happy or are we going to get grumpy, serious? And so it'd be like game night and he'd like come in all happy and we're like, oh, okay, we get happy tonight. And then the next time was like really melancholy and serious and staunch. And we're like, okay, we don't get Mr. Happy tonight. Like it was just, so learning to live with everybody's, and we all have quirks, I'm sure they could say stuff about us. So.
Was there a degree of quote unquote refreshment when you did come back just for, even though you were 12?
Yeah, for sure. Like being able to sit in your sanctuary and just worship, and oh my gosh, it was very refreshing. But for me, it wasn't difficult to then be able, I was excited to also go back, but some people that would be difficult. So working maybe with your mission pastor and where you're at and asking those questions, like, and just praying like, God, I don't want to go back home. I want to go back home and be like holidays. We would try to come back home. One time Ebola happened, and so the camp just shut down, and we were going to have to move to the city anyway during a quarantine time. And it was right at Christmas, and we weren't planning that Christmas to come home. But we were on the phone with my mom, and she's like, "Can't you just come home?" And like, "Oh no, we really just need to stay and pray it out." Well, we were packing our suitcases to fly home and surprise them, and we came in on Christmas Eve. And that was awesome. So, there was, being home for the holidays is awesome if you can do that. So we'll take a break.
Let me just do a
Okay.
couple comments.
Can I shut this off?
Yeah, shut that off, yeah. So with this final one about resettlement, the great thing that the Lord does during resettlement that I've never seen him do without being in a foreign land and then coming back home is God creates in you this heart of a pilgrim. And you say, it doesn't matter where I live in Africa or I live in America. Lord, it's you. As long as you're with me, that's all that matters. Like a small child doesn't care where they grow up as long as they're with mom and dad. And so when we go to Africa and we feel like we've been ripped away from our loved ones, and we were, and then we make all of these new friends and new relationships, and then we're ripped away from them to come back home, and home is not what it used to be. Everything's changed. Some loved ones have died. Some loved ones have moved on. And you find yourself in limbo, and the Lord says, I am all that you need. And at that point is when reentry becomes the greatest blessing of your life. But if you're not ready for that, you can feel like you've been kicked off course or you've been tripped up in your walk. And a lot of people come home without a team to help them do reentry, and they're so confused they never walk with God again. We've had missionaries come home and crash and burn in their Christian walk. Or they come home and they accept what it is and they look to the Lord, and the Lord says, I'm going to take you to a whole new level of walking with me. That's why we could move on to Asia, and then we could come back home from Asia. If God called us right now to move to anywhere else, we'd say, okay, Lord, it's you. It doesn't matter where. And the support will come from you. The love will come from you. We'll be totally at peace with all of that. Now, what you've described with all of the transitions that you guys experience, those are short term. Take that and deepen it through years and years and years and try to climb out of these incredible pits. Next semester, we're going to cover the same thing more in depth. Tonight is just the introduction to these cycles or the seasons of culture shock. Next semester we'll cover it. So let's take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, Heidi's going to complete the thought for us. One more question, sorry. Go ahead.
When you guys go to the mission conference and a lot of these guys are coming from this for a rest,
Right, yeah.
For re-strengthening and all, are they're a lot of them are probably in.
Yeah, a lot of people at the missions conference, and we like to come back during Christmas. And Phil Twente, the missions pastor for Costa Mesa, he scheduled the conference January 2nd, January 3rd. So those that came home to see their families stay over a couple more weeks and they do the missions conference. So when you see people coming off the field of the missions conference, just sit with them and ask them questions. Don't talk, don't give them advice, just let them pour out. That's what they need. They might have been over 4, 5, 6, 7 years. They just need to hear from you. And then the other thing that I forgot to say, and thank you for bringing it up, is during re-entry, before it's resettlement, during re-entry, don't go to people that have never been missionaries and ask them, what am I going through and what is this all about? They have no frame of reference. Like a soldier coming off of the battlefield can't come to me being a civilian, and I can't counsel him of what it's like to watch his own friends die or to have to shoot people and then live with the reality that even though I was called to be a soldier, I've taken somebody else's life. This is only something that a soldier can minister to a soldier in. So go to pioneer missionaries, retired missionaries, former missionaries, present missionaries, or missions pastors that have lived overseas. I'm not talking about missions pastors that have read a bunch of books. They've lived overseas and they know what it's like. That's going to be the crucial part of it. All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and when we get back, we'll hear the rest of tonight's message.